it is a very good question to ask whether or not a piece of research was done in a biased manner. It is very fair to ask that question, and not necessarily an issue of, restricting academic freedom to ask that question. This piece came across my radar recently from Science, and I think it came out following a different Supreme Court decision, but that's not necessarily of interest here to me as much as the context of what's being said here. And I want to point this out with regards specifically to certain things. And I encourage you to go read it for yourself, obviously, and go form your own conclusion as you will, looking at this amongst other things. From Science, dated July 4th, 2024. American academic freedom is in peril. Now, I will say this is an editorial, so this doesn't necessarily represent the opinions of Science as much as it represents the opinions of the authors. Just a note on that before we continue. Academics researching online misinformation in the U.S. are learning a hard lesson. Academic freedom cannot be taken for granted. Statement I would generally agree with, actually. They face a concerted effort, including by members of Congress, to undermine or silence their work, documenting false and misleading internet content. The claim is that online misinformation researchers are trying to silence conservative voices. The evidence suggests just the opposite. I will have a bit of a disagreement with that at a certain point here, and I will show you my point in all of that. But we shall see. It's sobering to remember that the principle of academic freedom scarcely existed in the United States until the 20th century, when the firing of a Stanford University professor over his populist political views caused a public uproar. The incident led to the formation of the American Association of University Professors, which released its statement of principles on academic freedom and tenure in 1940. The concept was soon tested in the 1950s when Senate committees investigated dozens of academics, including Nobel laureate Linus Pauling, for holding un-American views. It took a string of Supreme Court cases upholding academic freedom and the public censure by his peers of communism scaremonger Senator Joseph McCarthy to close this fraught chapter in American history. Okay, so that bit of history is definitely a real thing. I will note that I don't think the American Association of University Professors, my own personal opinion, is very close to its original intent because of a lot of things. Looking at their Twitter feed, they seem to be heavily biased in one direction. Just noting that for myself, rather than defending all academic freedom, as it were, at this point. So, that's just something I note for them. Could be wrong. Feel free to tell me. I'm happy to at least listen, even if I don't agree ultimately. So, this next section is just about other things that have been claimed to be under assault here, and I'm going to notice a lot of things. There's actually not a lot of citations for a whole lot of this in here to provide evidence of such things as they are describing, which is concerning, right? Scholars from diverse academic backgrounds have converged to research how the internet and social media reshape discourse, facilitate the spread of falsehoods, and get manipulated for political and financial gain. These efforts have coalesced into a field of study aimed at better understanding technologies such as social media and artificial intelligence, while documenting the spread of misinformation about elections, global conflict, the environment, and health. These researchers, from tenured professors to undergraduate students, have been subjected to online harassment, lawsuits, and repeated smears in partisan media. Some have received physical threats to their safety in comments, emails, phone calls, and even letters. Scholars at several universities, including one of us, have been questioned, investigated, and summoned before committees of Congress, ostensibly for colluding with the Biden administration to censor conservatives. No credible evidence of the alleged collusion surfaced. The real problem some politicians have with the research is that it can blunt ideological campaigns to mislead the public. Look, the harassment of anybody online is just straight up wrong. I'm sorry. I don't have any patience for any of that in here. So, no, don't do it. Don't do it, for crying out loud. It's not worth it. Not going to make anything any better. And it just tends to alienate more people either way. And this is an interesting thing here with it, is that there is the argument that this has happened. And it is horrible that it does happen. This is the other thing I want to note, though, is that there are at times reasonable concerns that certain things in so-called misinformation research, and I use misinformation loosely because who the hell defines what that is at this point is the interesting question. Is it whether or not it's truthful, or whether or not it fits a specific narrative, i.e., whether or not what is described in a news event actually matches, described by someone, be it a news outlet, be it another thing, is actually true to what happened, or true to what was said, or true to basically true to reality, as opposed to true to some narrative. And there's a reason I want to get into this a little bit more and make the point, because what I don't think these researchers realize is while the harassment is wrong, straight up wrong, and I will say that many times again, the problem with some of this is that there is reason to be concerned about whether or not the research is biased in a particular direction, or whether or not it is being unbiased and finding actually, well, yeah, there is more misinformation over here than there is over here. Truthfully, there's based on observation, I would say there's actually misinformation from both extremes. But here's the reason I say that. I talked about this article in a previous video. I called it "Follow the Trail," where I was just using this to make a point about go backward, how to go backwards through multiple articles and find something if there's something of interest. This was a Nature article published in June. Post January 6th, deplatforming reduced the reach of misinformation on Twitter. Now, the reason I looked at this particular article was they had in this article discussed many times over what's called misinformation URLs. And that's how they were tracking the sudden decrease of misinformation, as they put it, is by saying they had a defined list of misinformation URLs. And that's what they were tracking through tweets and what have you, which if you're using like Twitter API or something, you can end up scraping that information and getting a sense of how many times this was tweeted and from which accounts and who follows who and some of those kinds of things. That's in very general, broadest terms how some of this kind of research is done. But what struck me as really interesting with this particular article is in its methods and in its supplemental material, it never gave you what that list of misinformation URLs was, and it gave you a very poor description of how they were defined that basically referenced to another article. And it was this particular article that it referenced to fake news on Twitter during the 2016 U.S. presidential election, where there was, lots of discussion about the spread of fake news on social media became a public concern in the United States after the 2016 presidential election. We examined exposure to and sharing of fake news by registered voters on Twitter and found that the engagement with fake news was extremely concentrated. Only 1% of individuals accounted for 80% of fake news exposures, and 0.1% accounted for nearly 80% of fake news sources shared. Individuals most likely to engage with fake news sources were conservative-leaning, older, and highly engaged with political news. Cluster of fake news sources shared overlapping audiences on the extreme right, but for people across the political spectrum, most political news exposure still came from mainstream media outlets. Now, the reason I brought this one up is, of course, this article was cited by this article, and during the Follow the Trail video, I went backwards through the supplemental material of this article, which is here, to find where the heck did they define the actual said fake news, and how did they define it? And the reason I went back through all of this and was somewhat perplexed by how it was done is the noting here. Let's see. Following the 2016 election, several organizations and individuals published lists of fake news websites and URLs. We used pre-existing domain lists both from trusted journalistic outlets and from prior academic work. First, we took 163 sources from BuzzFeed's news continuing BuzzFeed News' continuing series on fake news. We added PolitiFact's list of 200 fake news websites from May 2017 and FactCheck.org's list of 56 fake news websites from July 2017. There were two exceptions where pre-existing were not labeled as black, as it were. Let's see. We included a pre-existing list of fake news domains and constructed additional lists. So already you're taking sort of fake news domains from BuzzFeed, PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, and we'll get to the other one in a moment in here. We combined these sources with the list constructed concurrently by Guess et al., derived their list in part from Alcott et al., who in turn relied on sources listed by both Snopes.com and BuzzFeed. So in other words, they combined with Guess and derived their list from Alcott, who also got their fake news sources from Snopes and BuzzFeed. Of the 92 domains on the list constructed by Guess et al., 19 were in the list we had compiled from BuzzFeed, FactCheck, and PolitiFact, an additional 22 in here. Inspired source credibility. Yep. Snopes again makes an appearance. Snopes again makes an appearance in determining. Again, this is all about determining which things are supposedly fake news URLs or misinformation URLs and what have you with misinformation research. In here, that is the reason I highlight this, because ultimately in this table of red and orange fake news sites in here that were added to this list, you ended up with what I'm sure a whole bunch of folks would recognize as right-of-center media. In here, some of the prominent ones being, for example, in this particular section, the Daily Wire, as one example here of one thing that was highlighted. Now, why do I mention that? Why do I mention that in here? Why was I focusing on Snopes, BuzzFeed, and what have you? According to, where is it? There we go. Yeah. Made it all the way back up here. Yeah. BuzzFeed, PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, and Snopes. You see them all right here. The reason I mentioned this in the other video that I did, the Follow the Trail video, is right here from All Sides Media Bias Rating. BuzzFeed News is left-leaning. In here with 40,000 plus ratings from the public, rating it as actually quite left of center, with independent review and editorial review and the community feedback on it in here. And of course, you can agree or disagree with the commentary, but likewise, Snope leans left at a very minimum. 10,000 community ratings, editorial review in 2020. Yeah. All Sides moved Snopes' rating to lean left following a June 2021 independent review by All Sides editors on the left, center, and right. It was previously rated center. We reviewed the numerous instances of Snopes' left-wing bias that we found during our June 2020 editorial review, such as slant. Things like that as just a point to make here. PolitiFact also lean left. FactCheck.org, probably the most center of the bunch, also leans left, actually, as rated by allsides.com, as it were, in here. And that's the reason there's concern. This is an example, and it's certainly not indicative necessarily of all research surrounding misinformation, but this is a point that is made here with this particular discussion in this article regarding research on misinformation. Let me be perfectly clear with this. I actually do think it is very good to go and be doing research on how false information, because I don't like misinformation, because that's a manipulated term, but false information, things that are very, very demonstrably not true in the slightest, gets around very quickly, whether it be through artificial intelligence. Deepfakes in particular is of an interesting concern to me, as well as just out of context videos, all of those kinds of things, how they get around quickly, as well as, false news articles. that do get written by some groups, whether they be left or right, is actually very, very good to consider carefully. I do not disagree, and I do agree that they should be left to do that particular research. The question that I have is whether or not there is a certain degree of bias there in some of the research. Not all, some. I'm going to preface this very carefully here for you. I do not necessarily think all, but for example, in the case of that particular issue where it shows up in Nature and Science, where it has broad reach and wide publication, I can go back and say that it was based upon biased sources. Snopes, BuzzFeed, PolitiFact, and FactCheck.org, which were used in a trail of articles, are all biased sources for determining what counts as a misinformation URL. And so that's one of the reasons for the concern about misinformation and so-called research in misinformation, because misinformation in air quotes, that is not research, because it is a question of whether or not it is itself biased. Now, in terms of congressional hearings and testimony on the matter, no. Frankly, I do think with this you need to butt out, and it's not appropriate. And again, no degree of harassment is appropriate either against anybody. But it is fair to ask a question as to whether or not any piece of research, any individual piece of research, and all I showed was an individual piece. This is just to make it very clear. All I showed was an individual piece of research. It is a very good question to ask whether or not a piece of research was done in a biased manner. It is very fair to ask that question, and not necessarily an issue of, restricting academic freedom to ask that question in any way, shape, or form. So that would be my kind of thoughts on the topic, in that you need to actually consider the fact that maybe there's a touch of a problem. And at least for some of the literature, for some disciplines that are out there, we know there's problems with ideological bias in some disciplines. And so that is something to be concerned about, and all this kind of stuff. So to wrap it up, asking about bias in research is certainly acceptable. Harassment is not acceptable in these kinds of, in anything really. Harassment is not acceptable in this. Academic freedom is actually really important, and I do think there should be free to do research regarding the spread of false information. I refuse to use the word misinformation because of the basically doesn't mean all that much necessarily, but actual false information along online, particularly with AI and deepfakes. There you go. I do think you should be able to do that. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.